Welcome to the podcast hosted by timecam.com on how to stay on top of your work.
Podcasting from Poland. And hey, I bet you can hear that from my accent. Now, this is Stay on Top of Your Work podcast, the podcast about work, business, management, and all the things that keep us going in work and life. And I am your host, Kate, and here I talk about different things with my guests. But if there's anything special you'd like me to talk about with my guests, let me know in comments. And today I am going to talk with Lauria Ries. So don't go anywhere if you want to learn about marketing tricks, positioning, and how to stand out as a brand. Hi, Laura. I am happy to have you here today. I'm really excited.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure.
Thank you. So I'd like to begin with asking you the question which I always ask my guests because I think it's really inspiring to say a few words about yourself. What do you do and what are your professional interests?
I'm in marketing and I'm also a mom. I have two young boys and they are big time swimmers. So spent my weekend, I go from work and I spent the entire weekend at the pool watching them swim and cheering them on. So it's a busy schedule. And of course, it's a very family oriented life that I lead because of course I'm partnered with my one and only father, Al Ries. So it's been a real joy to combine my two passions together.
That's great. So when we talk about marketing, I'd like to begin with asking the question, what is the most important aspect a brand, a company has to pay attention to in marketing in order to somehow stand out?
Of course, the most important, of course, standing out is the most important thing, and the best way to do that is to have a narrow focus in order to stand for something. Of course, the goal in marketing and the idea of positioning is that powerful brands own a position in the mind of the consumer. It kind of flipped the script in terms of it wasn't the marketing and what you were saying that was important. The receiver was the most important, the mind of the consumer and what position you own in that mind. And the way to drive and occupy that position is by narrowing your focus, standing for something, perhaps by being in the first in a new category or by being the opposite of a competitor that gets you noticed. And then, of course, there's other little tricks like, visuals and verbals and battle cries and visual hammers that can help along the way get noticed too.
So do you think there are any good practices or methods that can help a company succeed or not really?
Well, of course. I mean, I think, thinking about not just, most companies are totally focused on, delivering a better product, a better service, and, hiring good people and having a good price and being an attractive product or service or building or all of those things. And of course, they're important. You don't want to have a bad product or service. Having a good quality product at the right price is important, but it's not necessarily what's going to make you successful. What's going to make you successful is by building a brand that people prefer over and above your competitors and are willing to pay you a good price for it so that you obviously can make a profit. And many times that profit is really determined by the strength of your brand. People are willing to pay more for a brand that they feel has greater value. And so the key really in your business is twofold. I mean, obviously you have to have the engineering and the innovation to do whatever it is product or service wise, but it's also important to have the other side. So what is the name of our product, our company? How do we communicate, through our name, our packaging, our visuals, our verbalizations, our slogans, our battle cries, what our company is, what we stand for, and make it, memorable and as well something that people are willing to share and talk about among their friends.
Mm-hmm. And I have a quote by you. If I'm wrong, correct me. You said that brand perception is a brand's reality, and I'm thinking, does it influence how people perceive the brand? Does it really that much influence how the product is, taken by the consumers? What do you think about it?
Well, absolutely. I think, the perception is reality when it comes to life. And so, we are very much, in the science and such, you're based on what the reality is of the product or service, when in fact it's the perception that others have of it that is really important. And if they have a poor perception of it, it's going to cause you problems, and it's going to be hard to convince them that you're not poor quality. If you have a very high reputation, sometimes you can do quite well no matter, even if you have glitches. For example, people love their iPhone, and they have made some mistakes. They're able to correct that because their perception is so high of the company, and they're so willing to pay a premium for those products. Or think about the most interesting example, and this has been done with many tests and studies. Something like wine, where you have an enormous variety of like $2 wines to $2,000 wines, but you taste, and not necessarily in your mouth, but in your mind. And if someone presents you with a $2,000 bottle of wine that's got a beautiful label, and it's from France, and it's dusty, and it's from a perfect year of a perfect vintage, and they pour it for you, and you smell it, and you taste it, and the people around you are tasting it and smiling, you have a great perception, and will likely say that that is a right? And they could have just as likely served you, the $5 wine, and you wouldn't know any wiser, because the perception of that brand and that experience is such that it changes. It changes, the idea of it in your mind, and the reality of what the wine is or was doesn't necessarily matter. I mean, that's the power that brands have, and the power the mind has. It's really the mind, believes, and we have to sort things out, and we believe in our minds that, leaders have an enormous advantage. People feel more comfortable, in many cases, going with the leader when they have to make decisions. I mean, they believe, and sometimes rightly so, that that's a safer bet, if you will, going with the leader, that they have a better product, better service, etc., which is why leadership is so powerful in brand marketing.
Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking about your book, Visual Hammer. What is that hammer, and why do we need it?
Well, that's a great question. Of course, we talk about positioning and owning a word in the mind, but the difficulty has always been is how do you get that word in the mind? And we talked about ways of narrowing the focus, being first. For example, Red Bull was the first energy drink, right? And so that's a powerful idea, but how do you drive it into the mind? Well, one way. Red Bull did is they used, and there's many different ways of creating a visual hammer. Sometimes it's the package itself. For them, I think Red Bull, it was the small size can. It was the 0.2 ounce can that was different than, of course, soft drinks were generally sold in 12-ounce cans. So it communicated something, that this was more powerful. You had to drink smaller amounts of it, and it communicated and made a visual difference. And that difference and that visual of the small can is what drove the brand. It helped drive, of course, the brand into the mind, and of course that category was importantly powerful and successful as well.
So what do you think are the main mistakes a company, a brand makes so that it doesn't stand out?
Well, I think the challenge is, like, for example, with the visual hammer, it's what I didn't also mention is it's a visual idea. There's two different, you've got words and you've got visuals, and they both kind of appeal to one side of the brain or the other. So the right side of the brain is your emotional side. It sees the big picture of the world, etc. And the left side is the more rational side. It's, it handles, words and concepts and analytical. And so, while words and positioning was basically, using words and ideas to get in the mind, we found that it was also very important to have a visual that drives the emotional side of the brand in the mind. It was more memorable, it was more emotional. So in the combination, if you will, of the two, of having, the strategy, the verbal side of it, the owning what, the category or the word, and then using the visual to drive it in the mind. One of the greatest examples, of course, is Coca-Cola. They very effectively use the image of the contour bottle, which is, the original bottle for Coca-Cola, a brand that, created the category, dominates the category worldwide for cola, and it reinforces something about the brand, its authenticity, that it's the real thing. But just saying the real thing is driven much more greatly into the mind when you combine it with that visual, and you can use that visual, of course, as they do alone. And so the biggest challenge, I think, again, of what companies have is it's very difficult to create a visual or find a focus if you're a company that sells lots of things to lots of consumers and lots of categories. Many companies are into way too many things that there's no way to simplify what they do. There's no way to find a visual to communicate what they do because they sell everything to everybody. And so you have, for example, Ford's latest campaign. And Ford's a company that sells cars and trucks and cheap cars, small cars, big cars, expensive ones. And so, they have a slogan, "Go further." That's not going to build anything in the mind. And if you ask people what's a Ford, I don't know. I mean, the greatest thing they have and the most success they have is in trucks, as being the leader in America in trucks, pickup trucks in particular. And so that's helped them the most, and that's generally what people think of them. But that again is the biggest problem for companies. If you think about what your company, what your brand is it into too many things? Are you, for example, like both Coca-Cola and Budweiser have gotten into trouble from line extension because it undermines the power of the brand. You have two choices now. If you want a Coca-Cola, actually you have way more than that because they've line extended like you wouldn't believe. But in general, there's regular full calorie Coca-Cola, and there's diet or zero calorie Coca-Cola. And, those two choices undermine each other because, one has all the flavor, but, way too many calories. The other one, has, the flavor, but it's filled with artificial sweetener, something that a lot of people are trying to avoid. And they also believe that it doesn't taste as good as the real thing. How could it? It's called diet. So, those types of things undermine what, Coca-Cola can say, or the same has happened in beer. You've got Budweiser and Bud Light, and they fight each other. They fight each other because they're trying to use the same name onto two very different categories when it comes to the mind of the consumer. The best way, of course, to handle that from a company standpoint is for multiple brands. And we've been and talked very, very much about the power of having multiple brands that each can define their own in their own space in the mind, in their own categories. For example, Apple, one of the most successful companies in the world these days, is a multi-branded company. iPhone is just for iPhone. They have iPad. They have Macintosh. Each category has its own name. The iWatch, or it's Apple Watch actually, but each category was launched with a new brand name. They're not all called Apple, for example.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned positioning. I'd like to ask you why it is so important, and do you maybe know examples from the popular culture, or from your own experience, of a good positioning?
Well, sure. I mean, I think, positioning is important because it's how you understand, the place that your brand possesses. The power is owning a space in the consumer's mind. So, it's not just about sales, it's the perception of that brand and how it's positioned. And then, things you can do to influence that. So, there's lots of great examples. I mean, for example, BMW was once a car that was was nowhere. It was 17th, as a matter of fact, in the U.S. In luxury or European imported cars in America in the 70s. It was nobody knew about it, but they positioned themselves. They narrowed the focus, and instead of talking about all the benefits, which is what they had been doing about the car, that it was good on gas mileage, it was fast, it was fun, it was this, it was that. They focused on one idea. They communicated it in a powerful way. Of course, the ultimate driving machine, a slogan they continue to use to this day. They combined it with a very effective visualization, which was the car driving, winding on roads and using television commercials, which, were very effective for several decades. That positioned it also. It's very, one thing that is not spoken a lot about when it comes to marketing. I mean, everyone's so focused on their own product and service and brand. You have to remember that it's in competition with who. Perhaps you're at the lucky point of, pioneering a new category, but most of us are working within existing categories, and we're trying to find our way and establish our position within that category. Of course, that's what BMW was doing. There was lots of car brands, but they were all trying to be everything to everybody for the most part. They broke through by narrowing the focus, by communicating something different, also communicating something that wasn't appealing to everybody. As a matter of fact, it basically was the opposite of what the leader's position was. The leader and the pioneer, of course, in luxury vehicles was Mercedes-Benz. They were perceived as, by and far the leader, the pioneer. They brought engineering from Germany, like BMW, of course. But they're also perceived as big, comfy, luxurious cars. And so what BMW did was also quite smart. Is it's too often people try to go against the leader by being similar but cheaper, right? Instead, BMW did the opposite. Instead of being floating on the road, they were the opposite, where you felt the road and more of a driving experience. They even had a famous famous ad campaign years ago. It was the ultimate sitting machine versus the ultimate driving machine. And so the success is based on how you can find your place within a crowded marketplace by standing for something that nobody else stands for. And if there's a strong leader, the easiest thing to do is to become the opposite of that. The same thing you can see in many cases. From Cross pens. I mean, Cross was a fancy thin pen, given at graduations. Well, what did Mont Blanc do? They came out with big fat pens, and that that visual difference, it was clearly seen. It was the opposite. I mean, are fat pens better? Who knows? It depends on how big your hand is. But it's a status symbol. It's a luxury brand, and it was a visual difference. Everyone thought you had to be thin when Mont Blanc said, "Hey, why don't we just be fat?" In mouthwash, you had the classic Listerine versus Scope. The Listerine was the pioneer again of the category, an antiseptic mouthwash that helped kill germs. They touted how bad it tasted because people felt that's what it means. You need a bad tasting mouthwash to kill all those germs. It was connected to the efficacy of the brand. And so everybody came out with their own bad tasting version, except for one called Scope. And they said they were the good tasting mouthwash. Now, there's bad sides about being good. People, you have the perception problem of people not thinking it tasted was going to, work as well because it tasted good. But they also had the benefit of saying, you don't want to have medicine breath mouth like Listerine. There was also a benefit of the good side. So, again, trying to do everything is, you often are trying to appeal to everybody. You often get nowhere. It's best to find a narrow focus, find something that's ownable, that's defendable, that can help position your brand in the mind, not just on its own, but in relation to the competition.
Yeah, and you said about the successful brands like BMW, Mercedes, and I'm thinking that not everyone is so successful. And how can we evaluate a risk a company, a brand is going to face among the competitors? Is there any way to do that?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think there's one thing that is not talked about as much is just the power and significance of the brand name itself. There's and now, we talk about, we obviously live in a global society, and, what you do find, well, there's a couple of things. Like one, for example, in the U.S., Peugeot has tried for many times to import its cars in the U.S., but the name is a problem. It works great in France and in parts of Europe that, speak and are familiar with French. But, in the U.S., an English market, Peugeot just doesn't sound right. And people, don't want to spend, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 for a Peugeot. And so the importance of the brand name, particularly as we go to a global, society and global branding, that you have to have. I mean, if you're looking at a global market, you have to have one name that's going to work. And what we found is, English has become the second language of the world, right? In business, we're talking in English right now. You have, if you don't live in an English-speaking country, you have your own language, and then, usually your second language is English for, business and other. It's the common denominator language of the world in many cases. So, for a global brand, what you have to be thinking about is something that sounds right in English. Again, does not have to be an English word. But if it sounds right for someone who knows the English language, meaning they can say it, they can spell it, it sounds right. For example, we don't end letters, end words in you like some of the Asian languages. So that's why, brand names like Sony, for example, were created. It was a made up word from the Japanese company that sounded right in English when they went into the US market. And you see the success and the ease of that name, for example, as well. You look at a Toyota, which is a Japanese name, but it sounds better in English than some of the other names like Mitsubishi, which has had, much more of a challenge in the automotive market. Globally, and especially in the U.S. So, the importance of the name itself, and understanding, perhaps the challenges of, it might have success in your local country, but if you're looking at a global, then going to the global market, you might think about changing the name. In some places, that's easier. In the Asian countries and Chinese, they have a picture language, so they have to have a second name when they go globally. And too often, they don't make a good choice. They use sort of a written out version of the character name, like Ting Tao beer is the leading beer in China, but it doesn't work on the global market. You can't say that Ting Tao beer. For an English speaker or any other language besides Chinese, it sounds weird. And so the importance, I totally believe in having the right name for your global market, as well as a local as well as a global market, will become increasingly important, as it's just going to be the reality that you build a global brand.
Okay, so let's switch now to the more creative part of the podcast, which I really like. You're the author of 2 books, Battle Cry and Visual Hammer, but also you wrote a couple books with your father.
Yes.
And I'd like to ask you, what are the topics you cover in your books, and what inspires you to write them?
Well, I'll start with the last question first. I think, what inspires us is by seeing and observing what's happening in branding and marketing and advertising and in PR. And we see what works and what doesn't work. And, it strikes us, and we develop these principles to help other companies understand, what it takes to give them, the tools and the examples to know, by watching history, we're not repeating the mistakes that were made before, and using the good examples. And so that's where generally the ideas for the books come. Obviously, Al has had decades and decades of experience working with clients as well as studying others. We are very closely watch many industries to gather information. And so, the really big ideas and books like, in particular, the Fall of Advertising and the Rise of PR came out of that. We saw, you read about, there was so much emphasis on particularly in the dot-com boom of the 2000s of using advertising, big advertising initially to get a brand in the mind, and it just didn't work. And we studied more of what companies did, and found the most successful startups were those that didn't spend any money on advertising at all. They relied in some cases and exclusively on PR. And PR is not easy to do because you need an idea. You need to be newsworthy. You need to have the right name and the right spokesperson and the right marketing elements. You can't force a thing with advertising. You have to earn PR, as a matter of fact, for the most part. So, it was a very, very big idea, and changed a lot of perceptions, and a lot of, what goes on today. I think people understand it, and it's become a lot, the media these days, with social media and the tactics that you use to employ these principles are different, but the strategy itself of becoming, you need to drive word of mouth that gets done through media. And then, of course, we've already talked about the power of a visual hammer. So the verbal strategy of owning a word in the mind. The crux of the positioning idea. But how do you drive that word into the mind? And so, we've suddenly realized there was an incredibly important, visual element to a lot of successful brands, from Coca-Cola and the Contour bottle, to KFC and Colonel Sanders, or Twitter and the tweeting bird, and just many example after example of how companies use not just a verbal strategy, but a visual one along with it, a visual that drove the idea into the mind. And we know that visuals have a much more emotional attachment. They're more memorable. And then again, the book that followed was Battle Cry. And there is an important, words are important as well. And I talked about the power of PR, and what it's meant to do is to drive word of mouth. But what you need to do is give people those words so they can talk about it. And one of the biggest problems with most of the slogans or taglines that companies were developing was they were never written in the ways that people spoke, for one, and they didn't use simple techniques that can help something become more memorable. Things like, rhyme or alliteration or repetition, reversal or double entendre. There's many simple linguistic techniques that can be used. So once you have your focus, once you have the word you want to own in the mind, once you have a visual that can communicate and drive that word, it's very then helpful to have that verbal battle cry that people within the company as well as consumers can use. And why, you see, if you ask someone, why'd you buy that BMW? Well, it's the ultimate driving machine. That's something that people would say, right? I mean, you don't ask someone, why'd you buy your new Ford truck? And they're not going to say, because I wanted to go further. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. So, in fact, then giving someone a battle cry that can be used, that resonates with why this brand is important, what it means, what it stands for, and reminding people of that.
Are there any books that inspire you in your work, in your life, or maybe something else besides what you just said?
Well, I mean, I think it all started when, I was actually a teenager, and I read Positioning: The Battle for Your Mind, my dad's book. That was, it just kind of opened, it's an amazing thing. And I wonder, I have my own children are teenagers now. And, when you go from the point of, your parent, your mom and your dad is, just mom and dad, to understanding that they have a life outside of being your parent. And that was, came to me when I read that book. Of course, I'd gone to his agency and visited his office, and I loved to see all the magic markers at the art station and the photocopy machine and everything else. But, reading that book really showed me, a whole new way of thinking about business and marketing. And it just changed everything. I fell in love with the idea and better understood my dad, of course, and how he viewed things. I think the books are written in a very simple way that people can understand to and relate to and act upon. You don't have to overcomplicate things. The hardest thing to do is make something simple and understandable for whether you're an author or whether you're in business. I mean, it's important that you make it understandable, that you don't all overcomplicate something that needlessly. So yeah, that book obviously played a tremendous role, for me going forward, knowing and working toward the day that we started working together in 1994. Over and above his books, I mean, I like to read about the histories of companies. We have a lot of books that chronicle the history of, particularly of Henry Ford is a very interesting story because, his focus, particularly, is just amazing. The history of what he did in the automotive industry is fascinating. And so, all of these things I think play an important role. I mean, just to be curious about, what companies are doing, and then holding and watching as they become successful or not. What's key, and the problem though, and a lot of the things to be wary of, if you will, in terms of the information that is out there, and in some of the books on companies as well, is that there's a great difference. Running a brand, you can think about in its lifetime as a little bit like an airplane. And so, an airplane, if you know anything about airplanes, they rumble down the runway, and you think this massive thing is never going to get, how is it going to fly? I mean, every time I fly, I think the same, we're never going to get up. And they have to use, and it's a huge force, 110% of power to get the sucker off the ground. And then of course at 30,000 feet, they throttle back to 70% or less of power, and you can go up and down, you can do lots of even small mistakes at 30,000 feet and recover quite easily, versus when you're on the ground or just getting off the ground, one small slip up and you're dead. That's a lot of a very good analogy for how brands are launched and developed and further then maintained. You see, when you're trying to get a brand off the ground, you can't afford any mistakes. You got to have the right name. You got to have the right visual. You got to have the right slogan, the right spokesperson. Got to generate enough of PR. You have to have the right distribution. All those things have to, be, just right in order to get it off the ground. At 30,000 feet, of course, you can do stupid things. I mean, at 30,000 feet, Red Bull launches Red Bull Cola, right? And, does all sorts of crazy things. And they get away with it. But, had they done that at the start, had they launched a wide variety of energy drinks and colas and this and that, they would have gotten nowhere. At the start, they were very narrowly focused, very focused on PR, on their imagery, on, one can, one product. That was it. There was no choice. And so again, you've got to think about, where your company is, where your brand is in terms of, are we trying to get this off the ground, or are we at 30,000 feet? You can't think, if you're going to get off the ground, that you can make the same mistakes that a company at 30,000 feet can make.
Mm-hmm. So I have a last question to you.
Yeah.
It's connected with the title of the podcast, Stay on Top of Your Work. How do you stay on top of your work?
Well, technology is helpful, certainly. The ability of for email and communications. You just have to just do it. How do you stay on top of it? Well, you have to be driven to know what your focus is, what you're good at, and do more of that and less of the things that you're not very good at. You can outsource a lot of things, for example, or you can get out of it. Listen, we run a consulting business, and we have focused on one-day strategy sessions. Because that's the part of the engagement that we're best at. We run a lean machine, so we don't need to do the implementation side. Our clients we focus what we did, so I can stay on top of it by doing what I'm very best at, and cutting out the stuff that I'm maybe not as good at or I'm not as interested in. And so I think that's an incredibly important part of, because people have a lot of stuff that they put off, or they don't do, or they should do. Figuring out what you do best, doing again more of that, being better at that, and spending more time on that makes you even better than at that, can be enormously helpful.
That sounds good. Laura, thank you so much for the interview. It was my pleasure to talk to you.
Yes, well, thanks. It's my pleasure. It is, I will say, amazing, because when I started in business, there was no email. It was just before email, and the ability of the internet and email to reach people very easily and to communicate with people so easily around the world. Fax was there, but it wasn't very efficient, or it wasn't very easy. But it is branding is a worldwide thing, and we've had great success with our books. books, and we've spoken in 60 countries and visited 60 countries around the world. And so it is a pleasure to pass along this information and meet people and understand and see for ourselves how the principles of positioning and PR and visual hammers work, not just in the U.S. but globally, absolutely, and sometimes even better.
Yes, exactly. Thank you once more, Laura. It was my pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And you guys make sure to follow Laura and find out more about her. Also, don't forget to check out her latest book, Battle Cry, and other books as well. Thanks for listening. Have a nice and productive day, and I see you next week. Bye-bye.
This podcast was brought to you by Timecam. You can listen to it on iTunes and SoundCloud. Subscribe to get more content and always stay on top of your work.